Hello, my name is Melissa Robinson, and firstly I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land from where I speak to you today. I pay respect to the people, country and continuing culture. I recognise this land was stolen from them and sovereignty was never ceded. Today I'm going to be talking about Australian Indigenous people and development. Firstly, applying the meaning of development in this context, and looking at Juukan Gorge as a case example of the impact of development on Australian Indigenous peoples, their human rights implications, and whether development actually does endanger the lives of people. So development, defined by the United Nations as a comprehensive economic, social, cultural and political process, aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and individuals on the basis of their active, free and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of benefits. So we're going to come back to this meaning of development later after we've looked at the example of Juukan Gorge and Australian Indigenous peoples. So Australian Indigenous peoples have been in Australia for a long time, between 50,000 and 120,000 years. An estimated population between 300,000 to almost a million when British colonisers arrived in 1788. The impact of colonisation by the beginning of the 20th century, it has drastically reduced to just around 75,000. So land is fundamental to the individuals and the collective in Indigenous society, and ownership is different from European legal systems, boundaries determined by family and spiritual connections. As such, it's richly symbolic and spiritual landscape rather than just a physical environment. But that colonisation policies aim to displace, disperse, convert and eventually assimilate Australian Indigenous peoples with the objective to clear the lands of Aboriginal people to enable the development of land. All in all, colonisation policies and the legacy of colonialism has meant that Indigenous peoples in Australia currently are the most impoverished, disadvantaged and disempowered group in the country. So we look at Juukan Gorge in Western Australia. It's located in the Pilbara region, northwest of the state, and is an Aboriginal heritage site, 46,000 years old, of ancient rock shelters. It is spiritual land for Australian Indigenous peoples, the traditional owners, the Putu, Kuntu, Kurrama and Pinikura, PKKP, peoples of the region. This is an image of Juukan Gorge and the two rock shelters dubbed Juukan 1 and Juukan 2. Skip forward 7 years, this is the same site in 2020, just 1 week before it was cleared just 1 week before Rio Tinto proceeded to blast the site. It destroyed those ancient rock shelters on 23rd of May 2020 as part of its expansion of the existing mine in the region. They went ahead to destroy the caves despite knowledge by the company about their importance in order to access higher volumes of high-grade ore. This was perfectly legal. Permission was granted by the WA State Government under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. As a result, the subsequent federal parliamentary inquiry recommended review of state and federal law, and the repercussions for the company were staff were removed and its global reputation tarnished. It provoked community anger and protests against the mining company and the West Australian Government heritage laws. So this was in the community. The ongoing colonial violence in contemporary society has meant that development and transgenerational trauma of colonisation endures. And Indigenous people at Juukan Gorge suffered personal, public and structural effects. Its grievability, the impact was personal and visceral for PKK peoples, said the parliamentary report. Marsha Langton said it was heartbreaking. And Birchall Hayes, PKK man, said his elders were deeply distressed. And that for those Indigenous people engaged by Rio Tinto at the time, it was excruciating to be Indigenous. Together, it reinforced a colonial consciousness and identity and the disadvantaged place for Indigenous people in the community. The public impact, the precariousness of Indigenous groups, how vulnerable their culture and heritage are to the imperatives of government and corporations, and the priority of commercial gain over meaningful engagement with traditional owners was plain to see. It reinforced systemic collective disadvantage and inequalities and undid all the good, the working relationship between corporate actors and traditional owners in development. The structural impact for recognition, reconciliation and compensation. There was a denial of self-determination, autonomy and compensation, and a power imbalance between corporate and Indigenous representatives in decision making, and that the laws provide no rights for Indigenous custodians, and those laws will always leave a miner in charge of decisions concerning its land. And that states who continue to fail to recognise international Indigenous legal status has meant that there has been no international legal consequences for the state or for the corporate power. We move to talk about development and modernisation, and that modernisation, as a response to decolonisation, has used science and technology and a united identity between government and corporate players to control knowledge and to control change and development. It emphasises the control of knowledge that informs government policy and facilitates the role of the state. It includes the suppression of Indigenous and alternative ways of knowing and being. And that this ingrained colonial mentality reinforces the subconscious patterns in the collective psyche. And that covert racism as cultural capital has all meant that Indigenous people have been internally displaced and excluded from deliberations about development. The Juukan Gorge example is a case example of deliberate acts of racial, cultural and epistemic genocide perpetrated by the process of modernisation. So Australian Indigenous peoples and development, well, in 1788 it was colonisation, and the objective was to clear the lands of Aboriginal people, to develop the land. In 2020, modernisation, which emerged as a response to decolonisation, denies Indigenous people the right to improve their lives. And I would also add that the objective of modernisation is to clear the lands of Aboriginal people to enable the development of the land. And that in conclusion, development can endanger the individual and collective life of Australian Indigenous peoples that violates international human rights. So Haveman talks about the systemic and structured inequality of access to individual human rights. And I've listed the United Nations instruments and the rights that have been contravened as part of the Juukan Gorge development program. Conservation and right to conservation and protection of the environment, right to life, freedom from discrimination, respect for culture and property, health, self-government and self-determination, the right to traditionally owned lands, and to the restitution for lands occupied or damaged. So development we looked at earlier as defined as improving the well-being of the entire population and meaningful participation in development, where we've seen from the Juukan Gorge development program that it hasn't improved the well-being but instead denied the well-being of Indigenous groups and has denied their free and meaningful participation in the development. So we look elsewhere, and Gilbert Rist provides a more accurate description of development as determined by modernisation, and that is the development as a transformation, destruction of the natural environment in order to increase production of commodities geared by means of market exchange. So in conclusion, development programs can violate individual and group rights of Indigenous peoples. Development reinforces a mentality of colonialism in colonialised states such as Australia, perpetrated by modernisation. And that Juukan Gorge in Western Australia is an example of development endangering the lives of people. These are the references I used for the presentation today. Thank you everyone, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.